issue that many of us have been wondering for a long time. A lot of us within the Palestinian community, within the Arab American community, and the broader community of conscious in the United States often ask ourselves, how do we as citizens of the United States address the fact that our own tax dollars are going towards the abuses that Palestinian people, specifically in this case, Palestinian children, face on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, and on a yearly basis. And finally, we have a vehicle, a tool to take action. And so that's what, in a nutshell, that's what House Resolution 2407 is. I'd like definitely to make this more of an engagement conversation, as opposed to just us dictating to the audience, anyone who's watching. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to put the questions into our Facebook live stream on the AMP page, and I believe PAC is also going to host a watch party on their Facebook page. So if you have any questions at all, we'll be monitoring the Facebook comment section. Please do ask and we'll address your questions. I want the majority of this conversation to be a give and take, where we're having conversation talking about what we can do as a community, as a team, to ensure that we are effective in this effort. So yes, then we will jump right into what we're talking about today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I don't think I'm gonna have anything embarrassing at all depicted. Just kidding. So okay. So House Resolution 2407, long title is the Promoting Human Rights for Palestinian Children Living Under Israeli Military Occupation. If it was up to me, to be honest with you, I would just be reading off the bill. The bill is insanely fascinating. There's so much detail in it, and it's so interesting to see how the issues presented in the bill. And honestly, there's a lot of room for criticism in the sense, not the way the bill is written or not the way the bill is being presented in the text, but rather the way we have to go about advocating for rights of the Palestinian people. If you see what we're talking about in this specific bill, this bill is the first of its kind. That is a bill that advocates for Palestinian, the Palestinian human rights and a just American policy when it comes to the issue of the Palestinian people. And in this specific bill, what it focuses solely on is Palestinian children. The criticism that I see, the room for criticism I see, is that it is not, we aren't talking about the human rights and justice for Palestinian people on the whole. But given that this is the first bill of its kind, this is something that we do have to support and we do have to fight for. And in the long term, down the road, that is when we begin to broaden the conversation and talk about the occupation on the whole. The question here is, how can we as a community, we as a people of conscience, stop funding Israeli military abuse of Palestinian children? So as Tala mentioned, alhamdulillah, this is a joint effort by PAC and AMP. We want our community to be educated. We want our community to be involved. And we want every individual to be able to be an advocate for the issue, an advocate for themselves, and to be empowered in that sense. So what we know, right? We hear this number all the time. $3.3 billion per year in foreign military financing is appropriated to the state of Israel in the US budget. That does not include 500 million that's appropriated for Israeli missile defense, right? The number that we always hear is 3.8, right? 3.8 billion yearly. In 2016, the United States and the state of Israel signed a memorandum of understanding, essentially stating that over the span of 10 years, the United States will give 38 billion, which comes down to 3.8 billion a year. And broken down, that's get your calculators out. That's 3.3 billion in foreign military financing, and then the 0.5, the 5 million in missile defense funding. So the 3.3 plus the 0.5 equals the 3.8 that we always hear. Now, how is the US government gathering the funds for this material support? Very simple. And that brings us to the age-old question: how do we stop our actual our money coming from our pocket to be used in the way that it's being used to you know, further the occupation and further suffering on the Palestinian people on the whole? What we also know: each year, approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children, some as young as, oh, that's supposed to be a 9, some as young as 9 or 10 years old, are detained and prosecuted in Israeli military court system. And Israeli military court system is a key phrase. This is not standard law, like not standard domestic law. It is martial law, essentially, military court system. So if you were to look deeper into the numbers of prosecution rates and what exactly is being brought forward against, what charges are being brought forward against the Palestinian children, that uncovers a lot of additional unethical, questionable actions by the Israeli military. Now, just for a fact, for you know, something to note for all of us, the number of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention at the end of each month in 2020, by the end of January, 183, by the end of February 2020, 201, and by the end of March 2020, 194 children. Of course, some of these are holdovers who are kept from month to month. The average per year is 500 to 700 Palestinian children. And these statistics were found by the Defense for Children International Palestine. That organization is the driving organization of the statistics of this information, and much of where we get our information for this presentation and for the bill and moving forward. Okay, give me a moment. Now I think that we might be getting some comments in the Zoom, and Hi,
Wasim. So Rochelle actually had a question. I told her you'll get to it at the end of the presentation. So I'll monitor the chat for you so you don't have to lose your train of thought.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Okay. So now moving on. What else do we also know? An estimated 10,000 Palestinian children have been detained by the Israeli security forces and prosecuted in Israeli military in the Israeli military court system since 2000. It's a lot of children. Independent monitors such as Human Rights Watch have documented that these children are subject to abuse and in some cases torture, specifically citing the use of chokeholds, beatings, and coercive interrogation on children between the ages of 11 and 15. The predominant charge that is levied against these children is rock throwing, right? So we talk about a system that is wholly unequal. You know, when people refer to it as a conflict or a war, we refute that concept because a conflict or a war require two sides that are equally capable, right? Two sides that have the same access to resources, two sides that have the same access to freedom of movement. But in this situation, it is an occupier and an occupied relationship, right? So that's why we don't refer to this as a conflict, but we talk about it as an occupation. Now, this abuse inherently, right? This abuse inevitably damages the mental health and the future of Palestinian children, and this directly contradicts the idea of any healthy future in the region, right? Now, I am, as I mentioned, the legislative coordinator for the New Jersey chapter of AMP. We often have meetings with elected representatives, whether it be with themselves or with their staffers. The conversation on the federal level of American policy is, okay, what is the future peace solution that we're going to support. And much of it is like, okay, a two-state solution where everybody has the right to self-determination. That's the American policy currently, is what I'm referring to. And now, simply, I always ask, how can we possibly ever envision a healthy, sustainable future when we are damaging an entire future, an entire generation, and causing untold, unmeasurable emotional and psychological damage? You know what I mean? So that is a very important message to be relaying to elected representatives and to people of the public when trying to tell them that this bill is a bill that is more than worthy of support by the society on a large scale. Now, how are the funds that we as a country allocate to the State of Israel used? This infographic here is the stages of detention of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention. It takes you from arrest to transfer to interrogation to hearing and sentencing. If we look under arrest, what we do see is that from the moment of arrest, this is the second paragraph under arrest, from the moment of arrest, 3 out of 4 Palestinian children experience some form of physical violence, okay? This typically consists of being slapped, punched, kicked, or struck with a soldier's helmet and rifle. This information was obtained from the information on this infographic at the very bottom. If you see there's sources, if you cannot see that, what it says is that this information is obtained from 2 sources specifically, the Defense for Children International Palestine study, interview of Palestinian children, and also a monitoring of these processes. And then also by UNICEF, the United Nations organization dedicated to the well-being and welfare of children. So transfer period can last anywhere from several minutes, several hours, and the child is not told where they're being taken. They are not given access to legal representation. Again, this is that key phrase that we talked about earlier. This is an Israeli military process. This is not due process. This is not, domestic law, but rather martial law. Interrogation, children are most often interrogated at a police station or an interrogation center. They arrive bound, blindfolded, frightened, and sleep deprived. I'm not one to advocate for the exploitation of these traumas that Palestinian children often experience. However, there are plenty of videos of the interrogation videos that have been posted online that show these untold traumas and horrible experiences that these Palestinian children experience. So if you are looking to learn more to be able to advocate better, not necessarily to be able to use it as a method of showing, I would encourage some people to look into that. Now, in the vast majority of cases, children are denied access to legal counsel prior to and during interrogation. The hearing. Children appear before an Israeli military court within 24 to 72 hours of their arrest, depending on their age. The hearing is the first time they'll see an attorney or parents since their arrest. So we're talking about 1 to 3 days left in a state of just not knowing, right? In a system that you see in the form of occupation on a day-to-day basis, and a system that causes so much pain and hurt. Now you're in the midst of it for days without any idea of what's going on. Hearings are conducted in Hebrew with Arabic translation. Much of the kids do not understand what's going on, especially between that period between arrest and interrogation. And then there are 3 parts to military court sentence. Imprisonment is a fine, and a suspended sentence. So I guess probation would be an example of a suspended sentence. About half of child detainees will receive custodial sentence of 3 to 12 months, depending on the circumstances. Some receive longer, 1 to 3 years. No person under the age of 12 can be prosecuted in military courts, and that is not within this system, but rather a statement of fact on as by international law and agreements that even the state of Israel has agreed to adhere to and clearly, doesn't. Now the bill at hand. House Resolution 2407. Again, I am a legislative nerd. I'd love to talk about how a bill becomes law, right? What it requires for a bill to become law, and how legislative sessions work. What I can tell you really briefly is that this is the second, excuse me, this is the second form of the bill. So it was introduced in the last legislative session, the 2017-2018 legislative session, and it didn't get passed, which honestly was expected because this is a long-term battle. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And now this is the second coming of the bill. There are some interesting differences in the bill. The title was a bit different. To present the bill differently to elected representatives. And then there's another difference that I'll highlight in a few, which I think makes a world of a difference, and then also makes the bill much more ethical. Well, I'll briefly touch on that right now. What the second form of the bill in the second legislative session, the way it was introduced is that it's a protection for all children around the world. So this bill does not only apply to the state of Israel, but it mentions the state of Israel by name specifically, and that's very important, which I'll touch upon in my next point. However, this bill does expand to other entities in the world that treat children in a very unethical and inhumane way, and that's something that we are on board for, right? You know what I mean? We're talking about genuine justice. We're not talking about identity politics. We're talking about justice for all children around the world. We're talking about humane treatment of people around the world, and no matter who you are. It's a very important thing for us to be advocating for. So the bill, it promotes to protect the human rights of Palestinian children living under Israeli military occupation. This is a bill that phrase is taken out of the bill and off of the site as presented by the champion of this bill from Missouri. Sorry, Minnesota. Congresswoman Betty McCollum. She introduced the first bill and introduced the second one. So what this bill does is it amends the Leahy Law. Now, really quick, the Leahy Law is a provision of the Foreign Assistance Act. And what the Leahy Law establishes is that no foreign assistance provided to any country can be used for human rights abuses, right? Now, the state of Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. aid. And the Leahy Law is never applied to the state of Israel based on many internationally recognized human rights abuses and in violations of international law, whether that be during this administration, the previous administration, or any administration before that, after which the Leahy Law was passed. So essentially, Leahy Law says you can't use the money we give you for human rights abuses. This bill amends the Leahy Law to include the treatment of Palestinian children explicitly by the state of Israel, right? And so the bill then, as I mentioned moments ago, it covers all children around the world, not just Palestinian children, but specifically identifies the treatment of Palestinian children by the state of Israel because the state of Israel has received immunity for such a long time from the Leahy Law that it's important that it's explicitly said. I don't want to mention any additional at the moment. I'm not going to mention any additional foreign governments that we can think of that should also be held accountable under House Resolution 24/7, but there are plenty, and we also support the equal, the equal execution of this bill on all actors across the world that abuse children of any background or identity. So now the bill is comprehensive. Now, the question is, okay, but how are you going to do that, right? How are you going to monitor how the way that the state of Israel uses the money that the United States provides to them in the form of aid? What it does is it establishes the human rights monitoring and treatment of Palestinian child victims of military detention fund. And it authorizes $19 million annually to fund non-governmental organization human rights monitoring of Israel's systematic military detention of Palestinian children, and psychological, physical, and emotional health and treatment for the Palestinian child victims of Israeli military detention, abuse, and torture, right? So now going back to my point before, very important to note that an entire generation is being actively emotionally, psychologically, and physically damaged, right? Now, what does that do to the prospect of a healthy future, the prospect of coexistence down the road? That hurts it significantly. And what that does is it sets the stage for the furthering of the rhetoric that Palestinians are the other, that Palestinians are the ones who cannot control themselves, who cannot behave in a way that's seen as, civil, right? Now, that is the cycle. You damage. We see, even within our own society where, maybe we do see, certain groups, certain children in this society being abused and targeted heavily. And we see what types of emotional and physical and psychological trauma that can induce. And then in this explicit apartheid system, it only increases that abuse and that negative damage exponentially, right? So this bill, as I mentioned, is very comprehensive and addresses that point, which is very, very important, and it shows the sophisticated nature of the bill. That part of the bill I don't think was in the first part of the first introduction of the bill. So the bill is evolving, and that also creates a sense of encouragement, right? That as time goes on and as the bill gets enhanced to fill any gaps that there may be now, that is where we'll see an additional number of representatives joining on to sign, to co-sponsor, and then hopefully with the overall goal of passing the bill. Now, where do we fit in, right? First step is always education. You got to know the issue. You got to know your resources. You got to know your allies, and you have to spread the word. Everybody tuning into this session right now, I can almost guarantee you is someone who cares, right? Someone who is willing to advocate for the just treatment of Palestinian children to ensure that their rights are upheld. So it's on everybody who's tuning in now and who watches this video at a later point to educate themselves, to know the issue, and to spread the word. Right, the resources are available. If you go to No Way, if you type in "No Way to Treat a Child," DCIP into Google, you'll find plenty of resources. Another thing that you can find is on the, as I mentioned, on the website of Congresswoman Betty McCollum. She has resources on her. So if you go to mccollum.house.gov, and if you want to skip over how to find it on her site itself, / Palestinian Children's Rights, has resources on 24/7. We should be able to find these things. So she defines the problem, has some information, some articles on to essentially illustrate the reality of the issue, and then she talks about other NGOs, whether it be B'Tselem or any other human rights organization that have monitored this issue. And then she goes and talks about the legislation, and then even better, she goes and it goes on to explain the history of actions to protect Palestinian children's human rights in the United States, whether it be House Resolution 4391 in the previous session or previous letters that were generated in June of 2015 and June 2016, which garnered so much support that influenced these bills being written, right? And then again, if you go to No Way to Treat a Child, if you type that into Google, it will be easier. Than this is the link, the URL. But if you type no Way to Treat a Child into Google, it'll be easier to find. It has plenty of information, story about the project, resources, updates, briefing notes, and then also how you can do something to advocate. Now, going back to where we fit in, right? Now, it's on us to get active, right? It's on us to reach out to our elected representatives, whether it be via phone, email, or petition. If you are watching the AMP live stream on Facebook, in the caption, you'll see a link to a action item from AMP's national office, where all you have to do is just fill in some information and an email will be generated and sent to your elected representative for you. Literally takes 5 minutes to do, not even 5 minutes, 2 minutes to do. Just type in some information and you're good. So if you have a second to do that, please do. And then also, I know Tala is going to be sending out the same link to all individuals who registered for this Zoom link, and potentially we're going to share on a wider scale with the community. And then also, it comes down to getting into these offices and advocating for them to support bills like this and other ethical bills. If you are interested in getting into a meeting with an elected representative, I do have a lot of resources to offer on how to do that. And I also be willing to accompany, assist, and support. Nothing beats a constituent themselves reaching out, scheduling meetings, and going to the meeting. But organizational support, structure is a big plus, and I'm more than happy to help and offer that. My email address is very easy. So my email address is wkanaan@ampalestine.org. So please feel free to shoot me an email at wkanaan@ampalestine.org. We can discuss what the overall goal is, how to schedule a meeting, and get into the office.
Okay, thank you so much, Wasim, for that very informative presentation. So we can actually start with questions now. Wasim, I'm not sure if on your end, on your Facebook stream, you were able to see any questions, but we do have one here from Rochelle. So if you want to start with that one, Rochelle asks, how can we organize to make sure that this resolution passes as the last one did not pass? I think you touched upon it briefly. Rochelle, if you want to unmute yourself and add to your question, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, he did touch upon it. So if you want more clarity. Oh, wait, Rochelle, we can't hear you.
Oh, I think now the mute is, she's not muted anymore. Go ahead, Rochelle. All right, we still can't hear you, I'm sorry. So, you want to give one more try, Rochelle, see if we can hear you? Okay. So I think that, I see your question as twofold, right? One, how can we ensure that it passes? And two, you added the caveat, unlike the other, this, like I mentioned, unfortunately is a marathon, not a sprint, right? What we need to do is ensure that with every step, every time the bill needs to be reintroduced because the legislative session is expires, we need to ensure that there's an increase of elected representatives signed on to the bill. That is the goal, to have increased support anytime we're discussing this issue. And that is where the challenge lies. That is the bar that we're going to set for ourselves. For example, in the state of New Jersey, only one of the elected congressional representatives in the state are signed onto this bill. Now, does that mean that there's only one that is willing to support the bill? No. What it means is that we need to do a better job in putting the request into elected representatives to support the bill and increase the number of elected representatives in the state. What we can do is focus on the state of New Jersey. If we focus on the state of New Jersey and execute properly and take care of our turf, then that is the job that we have done, and that is a job well done. And then from there, we can offer assistance to any other individuals in the movement who might need help in other places, other states.
I don't know. Do you have any questions on the Facebook? No? Okay. I have a question myself that I wrote up. It kind of refers back to what Rochelle was saying. I had an idea I was working on starting a website. Sorry, Rochelle posted in the chat. I had an idea that I was working on of starting a website that would post articles every week of every article and incident that was covered in several publications. I think that's a great idea. Wasim, I don't know. You can respond to that.
So whenever you can consolidate information, it's always a good idea, right? Whenever you can consolidate information for people to be able to access in an easy way, I would and do get behind that and support it for sure.
And Rochelle, if you ever need assistance, reach out to me. I'll put my email here in the chat as well. I'm sure Wasim's email is also in the chat. I'm sure he'd be happy to help. So there we go. My question is, going back to the tax dollar issue, I mean, it kind of seems almost ridiculous that more Americans aren't on board with the fact that we shouldn't be spending so much money on another country when we're lacking social services in our own country, when we're lacking protections for the poor in our own country or for children in our own country. So it's kind of crazy that, you know, billions of dollars are going to this country. So now my question is kind of, how can we frame this like conflict, or like you said, occupation? How can we frame the issues associated with the occupation in a way that would get Americans who don't have any personal connection to the Palestinian cause to jump on board? Would a good way to go about it is that kind of like framing it in a fiscal way, talking about taxes, just to present it on a level where they can all feel like they have something to gain from supporting this?
So the best way to package it in a messaging sense is to introduce and to present multiple benefits, right? So absolutely, right? We as a society lack so many social needs, whether it be healthcare or employment security or whatever it may be. That is one way to relay that message, right? Another way is the way that this bill is presented. And as I mentioned earlier, I can't help but to feel critical of the fact that this bill only focuses on Palestinian children, but that in turn makes it, unfortunately, and I think that may be the reason as to why it is presented in this way, it makes it easier to be able to present it to people outside of the circles that we are used to, right? When we talk about supporting the welfare and the human rights of a child, we talk about the statistics, you talk about the realities. There are many resources available. So coming at it from that angle also, we're talking about children here. We're talking about preserving a future, right? We're talking about working towards an actual understandable solution for all parties involved, one that is genuine and one that is sufficient to serve the needs and rights of all people. You know what I mean? So those are three right there. We're talking about funding and the way we spend our money as a country. We're talking about the welfare and well-being of children. And then we're also talking about the actual hope of a just future.
And then I also have another follow-up question. So let's say it's hard to break through that barrier and get to your elected officials. Sometimes, money plays a big role in decision-making in this country, unfortunate reality. Would you suggest grassroots mobilization in the sense where you force elected officials to care because the constituents care? And how would you go about that?
I always say there are two forms of currency in Washington, D.C. There's quite literal currency, right? Money. And then there's also votes, right? I think that I choose to actively be part of the grassroots element of this movement because there need to be leaders among the community, educating the community, advocating to the community, and empowering them to mobilize in order for everybody else to be successful. You know what I mean? We get into offices and we have these conversations, but it comes down to, okay, but where are my constituents? I don't hear anything about Palestine. Now, how do we do that? Simple. It's very easy. Calls, right? We need to be able to mobilize as a community and be like, all right, everybody, this is a call to action that we're putting out that we need to execute. We're getting calls into these offices between these two times. And then you get mass calls in a certain time frame to show that there is a saturated part of the constituency that cares about this issue, right? And then also meetings not only by organizations, but also by constituents. When we meet with elected officials, we ensure that we have constituents present. You know what I mean? Who am I to go talk to them? That for me to go and talk to them as a member of an organization only perpetuates what we try to prevent, which is like special interests. I don't want them to do it because I care. I want them to do it, one, because their constituents care, and two, because it's a just cause. You know what I mean? So those, we have to kind of, and that is a grassroots mindset, right? So the grassroots mindset, that is what our activity should be rooted in. You know what I mean? So there is plenty of room for the grassroots mindset in this effort, and it should actually be focused on that.
Awesome. Thanks. Does anyone else have any questions before I get in? Because I think this is a great time to segue into the census in terms of representation. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat now. In the meantime, I will briefly talk about the importance of the 2020 census. I think especially when we're talking about legislative change in our country, it's really important to, and representation, like you were saying, having constituents call and having people understand that there's a community here who cares about this issue and they are your voters. The census is also something that takes 5 to 10 minutes, and for the first time in history, it can be done online or over the phone. So if you haven't done it yet, all you have to do is log on to 2020census.gov. It's available in Arabic and English and a plethora of other languages, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes, and you will be able to actually write in for the first time ever, instead of just clicking, your ethnicity as white, Hispanic, or other. Now you can write other, and there's an option to write in what you identify as, which I think is super, super important. Of course, I can't tell anyone what to write into their census, but I know personally, I love that I can write Palestinian American or Palestinian or Arab American, because now in the future, when they're looking at demographic information that's collected throughout the state, elected officials are going to look at it and say, hey, you know what, maybe I should care about this Palestinian issue a little more, because Patterson's got this huge population of Palestinians and they're all voters and they're all going to put me in office if I care. And it's also about identity. Sometimes as a first gen here in the US, I kind of feel a little confused or lost. I'm not Arab enough, or I'm not American enough. There's that weird dichotomy, but I think this is kind of cool. You can reclaim your identity. You can write Palestinian, and you can feel Palestinian and American. And this applies for any ethnicity. Really, you can reclaim your identity and kind of assert that you belong somewhere, because you're going to carve out a place for you to belong. But yeah, just going back, most importantly, representation. If they see that there are Palestinians in an area, politicians may eventually have to change their stance on the Palestinian issue because they need to get elected. Like you said, that's currency. This is a great way for us to get more currency, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes. So now that you guys have all listened to my little spiel, I'm going to share a survey in the chat. The survey takes about 2 minutes, and by completing the survey, you are entered into a monthly raffle for a $50 gift card. We give out 3 a month, so your chances are pretty good, considering 4 people have attended this so far. So I would definitely fill out that survey, and thank you guys. Any other questions before we sign off? No?
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Cool. Thanks. I'm just going to stop recording now, and then I guess Wasim, you can stop streaming. And we can go over.